Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Bandazian, chairing the House Bill 737 Commission for the Study of PFAS chemicals and the impacts on the environment and health. This is the June 9th, 2023 meeting of the Study Commission. And so I first call the meeting to order. And first order of business is approval of the minutes of the May 12th meeting, which Michael Strand was kind enough to prepare for us. Any questions, comments? Yes, Michelle.
Yes, Chris, I sent along this morning some changes to the the information, the DHHS updates that I had sent a written version to you before the meeting, and so basically what I did is I just took those written updates and put them into the minutes. Because I essentially read those during the DHHS updates. So I made that edit, and then I also had abstained on the April minute vote because I was not present at that meeting. So just those two corrections.
Okay. And did those go to Michael? Those corrections?
No, I sent them this morning to you. I apologize. I wasn't sure who to send them to.
They're probably in my other folder or something like that. Good afternoon, Dr. Woods. Good to see you.
Chris, I forgot the minutes. Do you know when they were sent?
About a week ago. But why don't we hold off on approval of the minutes since we have some corrections from Michelle and others, and Rosemary hasn't gotten them. Were there any other questions or comments about the minutes? All right, so we'll hold that over until our next meeting. Kathy Beam, you're up next.
Okay. Let me just. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just trying to share my screen. Does everybody see the public hearing presentation screen? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you, Chris, and the commission members. As you know, my name is Kathy Beam. I work in the air division. I've been working on the Saint-Gobain project since the water contamination issue was first identified. The reason I wanted to come today was because we as a department issued a draft permit with supporting documentation a couple of weeks ago with a public hearing scheduled for June 21st in Merrimack at the Merrimack High School Little Theater at 6 p.m. on Wednesday, June 21st. And so this presentation I'm going to give to you today is pretty much the presentation I'll give that night. I'm trying to balance giving a lot of information to people like you who have, an in-depth interest and knowledge about this, but also providing a shortened version so that people can really provide comments to the department, because that's really what the public comment period and hearing is for, is to gain information from the public, not necessarily to listen to me talk for the whole duration. So I'm going to try to balance that today. I just wanted to mention the hearing itself. We've announced it as being a hybrid hearing. We're working pretty hard on getting that set up. We're going to be down in Merrimack on Tuesday practicing and getting it all organized. We are not production professionals, and so one of the concerns I had is having sort of a backup plan if the internet system doesn't work. So we've invited Merrimack TV to be there, and they have set it up so that it can be broadcast at least in Bedford and Hudson, as well as on the internet and Roku and Apple TV and whatever it is that Merrimack TV typically broadcasts on. So even if our online system for some reason fails, people can still hear it. The public comment period will be open until June 28th, so that also provide people time to prepare comments if they wish. So with that, I think I'll just jump right into the presentation. So as you know, Saint-Gobain installed a regenerative thermal oxidizer as part of the PFAS statute that was passed in 2018. They're currently operating under a temporary permit. And the permit action that I'm going to be talking about today is taking that temporary permit and the applications that they've submitted over the course of the last couple of years and putting it into an operating permit. And I'll explain a little bit about that. Let's see here. So typically I would go over the facility, describe how it operates, what we did for a review of the applications and the data that we've received, and then talk about what regulations apply, what emissions they have today, and what the permit contains for conditions, and then open it up for comment period. As you all pretty familiar with the facility, they have a fire pump, an emergency generator, a small boiler. This is typical type of stuff you'd have at any kind of industrial facility, or even a school might have some of these devices. In addition to that, they have an antenna cover fabrication area, which is really just the back end where they start to glue parts together to make the antenna covers. There's a few emissions from that, but not PFAS. And then they have sort of these ancillary pieces of equipment where they might laminate or clean the fabric prior to actually making a product or finishing off a product. And those typically do not emit any emissions and weren't part of the permit prior to the last permit that was issued. But because they do provide some heat or some pressure to fabric that does have PFAS in it, they tied it into the main header to the thermal oxidizer. So these are pieces of equipment that aren't coating pieces of equipment, but could potentially have some kind of emissions from them. They're very small. But the majority of the emissions, and especially for PFAS that we are concerned about in this permit, are the 10 fabric coaters. I've got the emission unit numbers there to correspond with what's in the permit. They also, in April, asked that the department consider a request where they could take what's called the MTM laminator and make it a coater as well. So at the present time, it's only designed to laminate a couple layers of fabric together or put film between two fabric. And then they would take that material, take it off to a coater and coat it separately. They're asking to add a dip pan to this emission unit to allow them to coat right on that piece of device. And so that increases the coating capabilities of the facility, and we had to evaluate that. And then they have a couple of film lines that make film. Those, along with the fabric coaters, are all tied into the main header and are all controlled by the thermal oxidizer. So today I just want to kind of focus on these PFAS units, the thermal oxidizer itself, and of course the bypass stack that many of you probably heard about. So I won't go into the whole details of the system. I think we probably all know it pretty well, but basically, they take raw materials and they put it into a coater. It goes up through the coater through 3 sections that actually pushes or volatilizes off water and surfactants and those. So you have the pollutants that are all coming out of the stack. In the past, it would have come out of individual stacks on the roof. Now all the processed gases go to a main header, and that main header goes to the thermal oxidizer. And what I have listed here are the potential sources of, or potential pollutants that could come off from these sources. So PFAS, volatile organic compounds, hazardous air pollutants or toxic air pollutants, and then criteria pollutants, which are basically from the result of burning fuel in the towers. So like the fabric coaters, the film lines do pretty much the same thing, except instead of coating a fabric, they coat a belt that gets reused. And the QX tower has 5 stages, so it's a pretty big piece of equipment, and they can run coating in any one of or combination of the 5 stages of the QX tower. Same thing goes on, same type of gases with emissions come out. All of this again is tied to the RTO. So this is an actual picture of the Saint-Gobain regenerative thermal oxidizer. I just wanted to point out some parts of it that I'm going to be discussing today so that we're all on the same page. As I said, the main header connects all of what used to be the stacks for the individual towers, and now they're all tied directly into the main header across the top of the larger building, down to the lower building, and then off the backside right about here. That main header then goes down into the RTO, which is that box you see in the center of the picture. There is one combustion chamber across the top, the silver box that you see there. Inside the combustion chamber, there's 2 natural gas-fired burners. And then there are 3 recovery chambers, and I'll describe why they have 3 and how those work in just a moment. And then if you look at number 5 over there, this is the process fan that if you heard about, there was a fan failure last fall. They had to replace it. They had to shut down for several days. Each of the towers and film lines have fans on them to pull the exhaust out of those devices and send them in the past up to a stack. This fan actually pulls all those gases now through the main header and through the RTO. And this is the fan that actually failed and had to get replaced. And then when I refer to outlet emissions, post RTO emissions, it's the emissions that are coming off from the main stack, which is the number 6 there. And as you can see, there's some yellow scaffolding. That's where we would have taken samples during stack tests for what was emissions coming out of the thermal oxidizer. Now, just to give everybody an understanding, the thermal oxidizer is not a novel piece of equipment. Its use in this situation is what's novel. So thermal oxidizers have been used to control volatile organic compounds and toxic compounds for many years. They basically provide a system in which heat is introduced and a thermal reaction occurs to break those compounds down into generally carbon dioxide and water. Nothing is 100%, so you do get some products of incomplete combustion, and that's why there's some limitations on what the PFAS emissions can be coming out of the RTO. In this particular case, since they're being used for destruction of PFAS compounds, not only do you have a typical VOC or RTAP source, but you have this PFAS that's coming in, and the fluorine that's part of that PFAS molecule can attach to hydrogen and become hydrogen fluoride, another regulated toxic air pollutant that we regulate here in the state of New Hampshire, as well as a hazardous air pollutant regulated by EPA. So that's sort of the uniqueness of this, is how it's being used, not the fact that it is a piece of control equipment for a coder. The thermal oxidizers, really there's 3 key parameters that you have to look at. How long are the gases in the combustion chamber? How hot are they? And are they getting enough turbulent flow to get the reaction to cover the entire pollutant within that chamber? As I said, these are control devices that typically are used for VOC controls, so usually in the 14 to 1600 degree Fahrenheit range. The permit that they have requires that they be over 1832 degrees Fahrenheit or 1000 degrees C. That's what they're required to operate under, and that's what they were required to operate when we did the stack test to verify destruction. The reason for that is because carbon fluoride bonds are the strongest in nature and so require more thermal heat to break them. So I won't go into all the details of how a thermal oxidizer works. I do have kind of an animation here of sort of a smoke that's going through it. The basic premise is that if nothing is operating and they turn on the RTO, they have to get the RTO up to temperature before they can actually turn on any of the process equipment. So in startup mode, when nothing's running, the system is locked in, it has interlocks in place such that it has to get above 1832 before the towers can start operation. Okay, so startup mode, or if they're in a standby mode and they're at lower temperature, nothing can run and be brought online until the temperature gets up above 1832. Inside the actual combustion chamber, there's 2 natural gas burners. That's what would come on, that's what would heat up in there, and that's what would indicate the temperature. They have thermocouples in there measuring temperature. The gases would then, the process would start, the gases would start to come out of the towers and the film line, they would go through the header. The poppet valves, these things on the bottom, basically direct the flow of this gas. So you've got gas that's going to come in, it's going to go through, let's say, heat recovery chamber number 1. It's going to heat up in that chamber. It's going to get its heat from, usually in their first pass, it's going to be cool, but then once it gets started, that is going to get its heat from the ceramic media that's in that chamber. That media provides the turbulence, so you've got this gas that's flowing very smoothly through the main header. The ceramic media makes sure that the gas now is very turbulent, mixing well. You get it into the heat recovery chamber, it's starting to get preheated. Then that gas is going to go up into the combustion chamber where it's going to be exposed for that time and the temperature to get the reaction to occur. And then the heat from in the gases that are coming from the combustion chamber are now going to release that heat to the ceramic media in the 3rd chamber, let's say, before going out to the stack. That way the gases are cooled down, and the ceramic media is preheated. So the next time the gases come through, they're going to get that heat. And so it starts the process a little bit sooner in the reaction. As the valves are opening and closing, you have sort of this puff of gas that's not getting controlled. So when the permit was written, it was required that they have 3 chambers, because that allows sort of that puff of gas to sit within that 3rd chamber until the time that it gets reintroduced and controlled. So that's trying to minimize how much uncontrolled is actually being released. So that's sort of how an RTO works in a brief kind of synopsis. Now, let's talk about the bypass operation. So emergency bypass systems are critical to RTO operation. They are typical of most RTOs. They're designed to protect either the individuals within the building, people around the facility, the control equipment itself, and even the upstream process equipment. In the case of the Saint-Gobain RTO, there's 11 modes of operation that the RTO can operate under according to the owner's manual that came with the product that came from the vendor and has been evaluated. There's startup, there's steady state, there's shutdown and maintenance modes of operation, but there's 3 modes where they could be running, operations of the towers are going, and something happens. Those 3 modes are the burner shuts off unexpectedly, maybe a power outage or something goes wrong with the burner. There might be an emergency shutdown, the gas to the burners goes off, or there's some sort of mechanical problem, the fan going off there last fall. There's an emergency shutdown mode. And then there's something called a high inlet temperature shutdown. This is a way in which the process equipment and the control equipment is measuring the temperature. And if the temperature coming in from the process gases is too hot and it's going to melt that ceramic media, this is one of the modes that will shut that down so that it doesn't destroy the RTO. So these 3 modes of operation are necessary for the RTO to operate. But because the processes, large towers, lots of different gases within them, if you just shut down and let it back into the building, it would be unsafe for the workers there and it would be unsafe for the equipment. They have this bypass. This bypass, as you can see in the picture, is kind of a candy cane shape. And you can also see there's 3 other piping of tower gases into that main header. So the main header is horizontal, and then you've got the 3 different towers that are on the backside of the facility being vented into the main header. And then as you can see, you've got the bypass stack that's kind of a candy cane shape. This picture was taken during the 2021 stack test. So you can see some of our equipment up there, some of the sampling ports and whatnot. When we talk about the inlet emissions or the measurements of PFAS coming into the RTO during the stack tests, those emissions that would go into the RTO are measured right here close to where the bypass stack would be. So we consider the inlet to the RTO to be the same emissions that you would get if a bypass was to occur. We use the inlet information to judge that. So let's talk a little bit about the application where we are today, and then I'll get into sort of what they have to do in the permit in order to ensure that they're complying with the regulations. So we got, if you remember correctly, the bypass was identified during the 21 stack test. They got a letter of deficiency saying, please submit an application to include the bypass, give us a monitoring plan for the bypass. This needs to be evaluated. It wasn't part of the permit. They submitted that in December of 21. In the meantime, we reviewed and approved their stack test report, their monitoring plan, and they completed all the requirements of the temporary permits. So 90 days prior to when that permit was going to expire, they submitted a second application, and that was so they could have a state permit to operate. That's typical across any type of facility. When they finish the construction phase and implementation of the device under a temporary permit, they submit an application to operate and get a permit. So there's 2 applications, and because they completed all the requirements of the temporary permit, instead of modifying the temporary permit, what we're proposing is a state permit to operate. It's good for 5 years and it covers all the regulations and the devices there. So that's the draft that you're looking at, would be a draft for the state permit to operate. So I won't go into all the different things that they've submitted. I've provided those every month through Mike Wimsett for the ARD updates. So this is all, information you've already seen or had access to. The last bullet is the information they submitted back in April about converting that one laminator over to a coater as well. So we reviewed all of this information, applications, the stack test, calculation of air emissions, what regulations apply. We looked at our own modeling as well as what their consultant had submitted. We drafted up the state permit to operate. We issued the public notice. And as I mentioned, the close of the comment period is June 28th. And I just want to reiterate any of the comments that you give me during this period, this presentation today. It's not the actual public hearing, so I need you to either provide it in writing or attend the public hearing and give your comments then in order for it to be part of the record. There's a lot of rules that apply to them, not unlike other facilities that have a lot of different devices. I'm going to focus on 3. VOC RACT, which is why they've always had a permit through the Air Division, even when they were ChemFab. The toxics rules, because that's an important aspect that's been evaluated. And then, of course, the statute that requires best available control technology. So that's kind of where I want to focus today. So let's talk about VOC RACT. VOC RACT has thresholds above which you have to do certain things and below which you have to do other things as a facility. This particular facility has always had a 50-ton per year VOC limit. So by being less than 50 tons, they're subject to certain requirements under VOC RACT. For the first maybe 10 years of their operation, they had a limit of 10 tons for each of their devices, 10 tons per year of VOCs. When they expanded in 2002, they had that limit removed, and being between 10 and 50 tons, they were subject to VOC content requirements in their coatings. They couldn't have more than a certain amount of VOCs in their coatings. And so that has applied ever since that limit was removed out of their permit in 2001. And VOC RACT requirements stay with the company even if, as you see, their actual emissions have come down below 10 tons. That requirement for coating concentration will remain the same. So that won't go away now that they've already triggered that. So as you can see, while they have a 50-ton per year cap, they have limits on VOCs in their coatings, and their actual emissions have been less than 50 tons and decreasing over the last maybe decade or so. HAPS is along the same lines. The federal government has sort of a threshold where if you're above any 10 tons of any one particular hazardous air pollutant or 25 tons combined, you're subject to a certain set of rules. They've taken a limitation on that. We've looked at 10 years worth of their actual emissions and looked at their hazardous air pollutants. They have maybe a handful of hazardous air pollutants, the highest one being ethylene glycol. Out of the 10 years of information, at most, they were around 2 tons per year for ethylene glycol. If you look at the fact that they run maybe 50% of the time, they don't run on weekends, or they might have lower capacity, not all towers at the same time. If you were to scale that up to say they run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, what could they potentially have for hazardous air pollutants? You can see in the third column there, their potential is around 4 tons for ethylene glycol. For all the HAPs combined, they're around 8 tons. And as I said, the threshold for being triggering federal requirements is 10 tons for each one and 25 tons combined. I have hydrogen fluoride in there. That is a HAP. It's created from the RTO. So we don't really have 10 years worth of data because they haven't been generating hydrogen fluoride through the RTO at least. And even looking at material balances and multiple stack tests, their potential emissions are, very, very small, 0.05 tons per year. So now, unlike those 2 rules, which have thresholds and different requirements depending on how large a facility or large emitter you are, we have a state air toxics rule. Those limits within the state air toxics rule are based on inhalation health risk numbers. So there are ambient air limits for 24-hour exposure and annual exposure for like 600 or 700 regulated toxic air pollutants, including all the HAPs from the federal HAP list. We've evaluated the RTAPs, or the toxic pollutants that could come from the antenna cover fabrication area. They use some glues over there. We looked at the emissions from the coaters, from the film line. We looked at them in combination of what happens if the RTO is running and the antenna fabrication line is running at the same time, or what if there's a bypass? What are we looking at for emissions? And we evaluated it as if the controls did nothing to the RTAPs. That's how those rules are written. So we look at it as if they had no controls, and would they comply with those ambient air limits? And they were able to show that even under any of those scenarios, for any of the types of pollutants that they have on their current list of raw materials, even HF, that they're able to show compliance with the ambient air limits for the toxics rule as well. So PFAS. The PFAS statute requires best available control technology. It also requires that after controls, those emissions have to comply with the air toxics rule and any other air regulations. They have to not cause or contribute to a groundwater problem. And there's another aspect about not being more or less controls than other facilities. At this time, this is really the only facility in New Hampshire subject to the statute. So when the temporary permit was issued, it was determined that best available control technology is a regenerative thermal oxidizer, that it has 3 chambers. It has a minimum temperature of 1832 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 second of residence time, 70,000 SCFM of inlet gas airflow. So that takes care of time, temperature. The turbulence is sort of built into the design of the control device. They're required to operate according to their monitoring plan, which was sort of in development during the temporary permit process. During this permit process, we went back and forth with them. You'll see there's a couple different iterations of their monitoring plan that they submitted, but it has become a much more in-depth plan talking about how they operate under steady state conditions, bypass operations, what records they keep, how they record those records, what they're monitoring, how they maintain the equipment. It includes capture plans for each one of the devices so they don't have fugitives within the building. It talks about the plan to keep the main header clean that was submitted to the town of Merrimack's fire department. So there's a lot about the monitoring plan that is really much better, much more detailed, and really spells out a lot of requirements. And I suggest that perhaps you look at that if you have questions. So in addition to that statute, it requires in the permit that they ensure that the devices are capturing the emissions, because you're not going to get any control of them if they're just fugitive in the building, coming out of the side of the building. So they had to have capture efficiency plans. The original temporary permit said the RTO had to be operated at all times. As I said, bypass is critical. So we're allowing under this state permit to operate utilization of the bypass stack for no more than 175 hours a year, and only under those 3 operating conditions. And we have monitoring and record keeping requirements to ensure that. And then we also have, as part of that backed statute, it says you can't cause and contribute post RTO. So we have individual annual emission limits for the 4 PFAS compounds that an AGQS is set for in New Hampshire, and I'll explain how that was developed. It's a little complicated. There's a lot on the slide, but basically what we did is we said, we do not want the concentration of water that gets PFAS in it, whether through wet deposition or collecting the dry deposition off the surface of a square meter area and going down into the ground, the concentration of that water to be above the reporting level for method 533 for water. So that's usually in the 3 to 5 parts per trillion level. So we don't want it to be above reporting levels, not the AGQS of 12 or 11 or 18 parts per trillion. We're talking about 3 to 5 parts per trillion. We don't want it to be a concentration that would be above a reporting level. We don't want them to contribute to what there's already a contaminated water source. To do that, we took AirMod, which is a deposition model, and we predicted, okay, if you had 1, and this is in metric units, but if you had 1 gram per second of a compound coming out of the main stack, how much is going to, at worst, land on a square meter area within the, the general vicinity of the facility, looking at stack parameters, weather conditions, building parameters, topography, the temperature of the emissions and all that. How much is going to land in that square meter area in a given year? And that was about 0.2 grams per square meter per year. So if you had a gram per second all constantly coming out of that stack, you would get about 0.2 grams that would land in that square meter in a year, according to the model. The bypass stack, as you noted, was candy cane, more likely to have emissions deposited on the ground. So for every gram per second that would come out of the bypass stack, you'd get about 0.9 grams per meter squared. So you've got this wet and dry deposition that's being predicted by the model if you had a gram per second coming out. How many grams per second could we allow, or how many pounds per year is what we ultimately put in the permit? We basically based that, as I said, that the amount of rainfall that would come down on that predicted PFAS and actually infiltrate into the ground, that concentration was less than those reporting levels. And that is combining the bypass stack with the main stack at 175 hours a year allowable bypass operation. So when you run all those numbers, the top table are the permit limits for the 4 compounds that are in the state permit to operate. Okay. Now I wanted to kind of compare that to what their actual emissions are expected to be based on last year's stack test. If you look at the actual stack test for PFOA, PFOS, PFNA, and PFHXS from 2022, when you say you assume 175 hours of uncontrolled coming out of the bypass and the remainder coming out of the main stack, their PFOA emissions based on that would be about 0.01 pounds per year compared to a limit of 0.69 pounds per year. So they're not even at 1% of what they're allowed in the permit. And you can see the remaining ones are even less than that. PFOA still is the driving factor in this entire analysis. But that just gives you a perspective that even if we're off by a factor of 10 on the limitations, their emissions are well below that. So how do we know that they're going to comply with all this? The statute and all of our permits require monitoring and record keeping and making sure that people are, monitoring what they're doing and keeping us informed. So as I mentioned, in the combustion chamber and in the 3 recovery chambers, there are 7 thermocouples measuring temperature. So the thermocouples that are in the chamber that's just holding the puff is being averaged in with the hot combustion chamber temperature to get us an hourly average temperature. So you've got, a chamber that's going to be somewhat cooler because it doesn't have hot gases in it being averaged in. So that's somewhat conservative in that it's looking at all 7 and not just the 2 or 3 or 4 that are, 4 that are up in the combustion chamber. They continuously monitor that temperature. They continuously measure the process gas airflow. So they know how much gas is coming from the facility. And they're also measuring the natural gas flow to the burners, making sure, so records of that will make sure that the burners are actually operating. Now, as I said, because this is an average of 7 different thermocouples, what we decided in the permit is that if they have a hourly block average, so they're taking these 7 thermocouples, they're getting minute by minute temperatures, they're averaging it across an hour, and they have to show that it's more than 1832. If they show that it's less than 1832 and that lasts for 3 consecutive hours, then they need to report to us. That doesn't mean that they don't have to keep the records of it if it's less than 3, it's just they don't have to report to us. So we've had some permit deviation reports that say last hour, we had 1 hour that was 1831, not 1832. Not sure that 1 degree is going to make a whole lot of difference, and giving us a 1 hour notification isn't really going to change anything. But if it's lasting for 3 hours, they need to take corrective action regardless, but at least we're informed about it. At least that's what's proposed in the draft permit. For the bypass operations, a little bit different. They're still measuring process gas flow, the RTO, modes of operation, the length of time that it takes place, what emission units are running, and they have to calculate out individual and running totals of PFAS emissions. Keeping all these records, but if their bypass event lasts more than an hour, then they have to inform us. So this gives them a little bit of flexibility that they have to keep the records at all times. They have a limit that's 175 hours a year, but we're still informed within an hour of them, or if an hour or more goes by that they're bypassing, so that we can ensure that they're taking corrective action on that. So stack testing. In the permit itself, and the temporary permit, it required an annual stack test. Under the consent decree, it required it both at the inlet and the outlet of the RTO. And of course, now that there's a bypass stack there, the inlet is as important as the outlet to know what these emissions are. So all of that has been put into the state permit to operate. The permit requires OTM 45, which is the only stack test method that's EPA's proposed. It's not even a certified method. It's still an other test method category. But they're talking about an OTM 50 and an OTM 55 that will look at some of those products of incomplete combustion. So there is a caveat within the draft permit that allows us to extend the type of stack test methods as they become available so we can get more and more information. It requires that when they do a stack test, they give us all of the analytes, not just the 4 that have AGQS. So we want to make sure we know what's coming out of the stacks. They have to do an annual capture efficiency test. They've always had to do that in this temporary permit. They're going to have to do it in the state permit to operate. That's to ensure that they're not having fugitives in the building. But one of the things that they've asked us to do is to give them a little flexibility on the frequency of stack testing. So what we put into the permit was an alternative. If you don't want to do annual capture efficiency testing, then you can install and operate a pressure gauge that'll ensure fugitive emissions are not going into the building, but you're still going to do this confirmatory test during every stack test that you do. So it's an option for them. They also have a requirement into this draft permit that they'll do annual PFAS stack testing for a minimum of 2 times within this permit term. So theoretically, that would be this fall and next year. If the PFAS emissions are at or below 75% of the emission limits for both of those tests for all of the analytes, then they can reduce that frequency to once every 3 years for testing. But as soon as any of the analytes return to above the 75% threshold, they have to go back to annual testing. Again, their emissions were below 1% during the last 2 tests, and they'll have 2 more tests this permit term at least, and then they can potentially go to 37 months, which would be a 3-year cycle. So as I said, the draft permit and the application summary, which I highly recommend you look at because it explains a lot of what I just went over with a little bit more clarity and detail. That came out May 21st. The comment period is going to end a week after the hearing to give people a chance to digest what I present, or if we have technical problems, and to provide their comments. And then, as I said, the public hearing is on June 21st. And then the department has 30 working days after the close of the public comment period. So let's assume the comment period sticks with a June 28th close for the comment period. That would mean that by August 11th, we have to issue a director's decision, either to issue, deny, or amend the permit, and include a findings of fact document explaining our reasoning for all of that. And I think that covers it, but I'd be happy to take questions and comments.
Thank you, Kathy. Excellent PowerPoint. I think that will be easy for the public to digest. A highly technical process. I'm looking for questions, so if anybody has any. Laureen.
Hi, 2. One is just a quick one. The MTM laminator request seems to be that they're looking to increase production. My concerns there is what happens, to the hydrogen fluoride, everything else. Have you calculated, do you have any idea of the impact of what percentage of production that will increase and how that plays into your brilliant math?
Yes. So the increase in fabric that could be coated as a result of adding a dip pan to MTM increases the capacity of the facility by about 7%. So we took that 7% and applied that to all of the potential RTAP emissions, toxic air pollutant emissions, and they were still within the ambient air limits. Hence why the permit allows them to do that, because they're able to comply. When it comes to PFAS, that device was already hooked to the thermal oxidizer. They're still limited by the thermal oxidizer to how much could be emitted before it would be above the reporting level for the method 533. So that limit did not change even with the addition of the dip pan over on the MTM.
All right, that was number 1. Number 2 is, given this is the HB 737 Health Commission, and the reason that I've joined this journey is because of health, because of people especially in close proximity to Saint-Gobain, who are what I would immediately call a sacrifice zone, health, air impact, in addition to drinking the water for many years. So I think every state has the ability to incorporate the best science, without waiting for the legislative body to direct them. Have you considered the latest science we have on health guidance? The EPA last June, 1 year ago, issued final health advisories for Gen X chemicals at 10 parts per trillion, which we are not even looking at. And we know, Teflon coating has moved into, different technology. 2 parts per trillion for PFBS, 0.004 for PFOA, and 0.02, I believe, for PFOS. So we have this health science has been incorporated into regulatory by the EPA. We know they're in the process of setting rulemaking for MCLs. They're looking at CERCLA. They're looking at so many things. So my concern is we have these health advisories that really got into the weeds and were put out there for all the states and the benefit in general. But here in these 5 communities, this is not just general, this is personal and this is specific. So is there a reason why the state of New Hampshire can't apply the best health science available and revisit the regulations that or body in Concord did a very good job passing several years ago, but we know in this commission that those numbers are significantly dated and absolutely not protective.
Well, I can say that the statute specifically says that it has to be an air emission source that causes or contributes to an AGQS. So I am, in my opinion, and that the rules that apply to this are strictly for those 4 compounds for which an AGQS exists. That being said, a thermal oxidizer doesn't really care about the emission limit or the laws or the AGQS or any of that sort of thing. It's a thermal reaction that's going to happen. And as you can see, much of the emissions of even PFOA are well below the limitations that are imposed in the permit to ensure that they're not above reporting levels. So one would assume that the same reaction that's occurring for PFOA would occur for Gen X or whatnot. I will say that EPA is coming out with an OTM 50 and an OTM 55, and those methods will allow us to identify some of those compounds, for example, Gen X converts to. We know that we're not capturing that in the air tests. But again, we don't have an AGQS for Gen X. We haven't found it in water that I know of in the groundwater. At least that's my understanding. So no, I have not evaluated that particular compound under those particular statutes. But
we do have data for Gen X. It has appeared in air stack testing in the past.
No, I meant in groundwater in terms of triggering any kind of AGQS.
My concern is I think DES has authority. Every state has the authority to go above and beyond if they choose to. And this state is kind of lagging the last couple of years, in my opinion. At the end of the day, this is about the health of the community and the health of the residents. And you've done amazing work in your department, and I know you're following the directives, but I really feel very frustrated that we have this corporation here who's done grave harm. They're picking and choosing what they're going to do. We have some great guidance coming up for technical and data and reporting and measuring. But, we've been testing for years and years and years, and we see the harm in people, in communities. And the testing is not going to protect the health of our residents. And that's my concern. I really would like to track this, not just track it and test it, but really ensure that exposure has stopped, not just reduced. Reduction is not enough.
What I can tell you is that they did an analysis on their raw materials required under the consent decree. And the amount of Gen X that's in their raw materials is much lower than the amount that PFOA had been in the past. So not only did they reformulate, but they reduced those compounds. And then you have the thermal oxidizer, which again is going to have the thermal reaction, whether or not they're controlled or regulated or not. So while I can't say definitively that there's no issue with Gen X, I am pretty comfortable with thermal oxidizer being a good solution for that scenario that you're concerned about.
Can we apply the EPA? When Gen X was first approved, the EPA gave a condition of use decree. And it said that in order to not just manufacture, but to use Gen X, you need to recapture and not release to the environment. So they had an efficiency rating there of 99.5% for the recapture. So 99.5%, not of whatever amount of any Gen X used by a facility, only 0.05%, needs to go into the environment, because that's all they could really do. So what we know from North Carolina is, DuPont was there first, Charmars takes over. They had to abide by that. The vast harm we see in that area to residents was due to that 0.05. That is how toxic Gen X is. So I just want to make sure that just other members of this commission, if anybody wants to follow up with me at any point, there's a lot of information about these chemicals, and they are toxic at extremely low levels. I'll just leave it at that. I just wanted to really put that out there because that's my concern. Thank you, Kathy.
Dr. Woods.
Thank you. Just following up on that, this is for my own edification. I've been, some of the background material that I've been reading, which hasn't been tremendously extensive, but there's been some comment at various sources about the synergism between the multiple components. We are concerned about the different individual components, but there's been some comment that, in fact, the deleterious effects are from synergism between these components is even far greater than the individual components. Is Kathy familiar with any of that material, or somebody else here that could direct me or provide insight about this problem? And we see this in biologic systems all the time, where synergism tremendously affects reactivity. And a perfect example is an enzyme. You change the subtle pH within an environment in a cell, and an enzyme dramatically changes its activity. So this synergism is a well-known entity in molecular dynamics, and I'm just beginning to see this percolate to the surface, and wondered if somebody could help me out or direct me in someplace.
It's an excellent point. I certainly can't provide direction. I'm not aware of any research in that area, but then again, some other people on the commission may be more up on that research. So I guess something to keep an eye out for.
I'll keep looking myself, and if I find something of particular note, I'll bring it to the whole commission.
Thank you. Yes, Rosemary.
Oh, thank you, Chris. And thank you very much, Kathy, for your presentation. I have a few questions. One, you stated that Saint-Gobain has to report when the bypass has been used for when the bypass is operating for at least an hour. Does that first hour where they don't report, so let's say the bypass is operating for 59 minutes, they don't have to report that to DES, but does that 59 minutes go against their maximum allowable hours of operation per year?
Yes.
Oh.
Any minute of bypass goes toward the 175 hours of bypass limitation within their permit. It's only a matter of triggering when they have to submit a permit deviation report to us. So typical RTOs, operate, and they might go below a certain temperature. And in the past, because we're talking about VOCs and then the rules that apply to them, they had a longer period of time where they could have an issue and then report to us. That didn't seem feasible in this situation. So 1 hour seemed like a more reasonable reporting level, but they have to keep records for every bypass against that 175 hours.
Okay, so eventually they do report to DES when it is under an hour. It doesn't trigger a reporting for that event. Correct?
Immediately, yes, that's correct.
Oh, okay. And then I was kind of interested to see that PFOA, even though it's below the permit emissions, you had a slide up there where you had 4 PFAS, but I thought they had discontinued PFAS in their raw material. Yeah, right there, the actual emissions.
The actual emissions.
They're having PFOA as 0.01 pounds per year, but I thought they had discontinued using PFOA years ago.
So I read through the stewardship agreement and the agreement by the big companies to reformulate and to eliminate compounds, and they had to go below a certain concentration or a certain percent that they agreed to, but it was never complete elimination. And if you look at polymer science, I think by default you get some polymers that are going to get created in the production intentionally or otherwise. So there's still a very, very small amount, even in the raw material samples that they were required to analyze for, of PFOA. So there's still a chance that PFOA could come out, and if they were to use the bypass stack 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, no limit, they would have it be detectable in the above a reporting level coming out of that stack. So they still could cause and contribute to a AGQS if they didn't have a limit, didn't operate the thermal oxidizer. So that it's a requirement to have that device in place and to have those limits. But yes, there's still a very small amount. I mean, if you're talking about, there was 2% PFOA concentrations back when there was primarily PFOA as a raw material in there. Now they're so below that you don't even have them on a safety data sheet, but there's still some remnants of them, of PFOA in their raw materials.
And one of my other concerns, and I do recognize the efficiency of the RTO of breaking all PFAS, but I'm very concerned that we're still seeing PFBA in our groundwater. It's showing up, it's breaking through the GAC filters on our MVD PFAS filtration plants. So I don't know if PFBA is on your radar at all as far as, but if it were to be added to a list of regulatory PFAS, would that trigger an amended permit?
So if any new AGQS are adopted, we have a mechanism for all permits that if a new standard comes into effect, we can open the permit and establish emission limits. So yes, that if that became an AGQS, we could put in emission limits, opening the permit.
Okay, all right, that's it. Thank you very much.
Other questions for Kathy? Yeah, just a couple of very basic ones for me. There have been a couple of times when, due to power interruptions, the bypass stack has gone into operation. Is there some attention paid to that in the permit?
Well, the permit only limits them to only 175 hours a year and only under certain conditions. So one of those conditions, power outage, would be covered because it would be the burner goes off. Matter of fact, in the update that I'm sending to the commission through Mike Wims that talks about the most recent bypass that I actually mentioned in last month's update, but I didn't have the link for One Stop in it. That was a high temperature alarm, so not a power outage, but it was a scenario of one of those 3 conditions that we allow for bypass, where the temperature of the inlet is too hot. Turned out it was a thermocouple failure, so they took down the whole device, put in a new thermocouple, and everything was fine, and the bypass minutes were very short. But yes, it's limited to 175 hours and only under those 3 conditions, and power outages are considered part of those conditions.
Is there, do you know if there is in the plan a backup generator, or backup power source?
This device requires a lot of power. You know, it's got the fan, it's got the power for all the hydraulics and whatnot. I don't think an emergency generator, for the amount of minutes that it's happened, I mean, it's usually like 2 minutes here and 2 minutes there. I don't believe that that's the case. Their backup generator that they have now is just to provide emergency lighting to get out of the building if it was really dark. That's the extent of that emergency generator.
And my other question is there potential for human operator error, or is it all basically component failure?
I don't think that you can completely eliminate human error. I think there's some ability to shut down the device if there's an emergency that's on the human side of things. But in terms of the conditions under which it can happen, I'd have to really look at the monitoring plan to see how those three scenarios fit with what the human aspect would have available to it. Not very likely, I don't think, but I could look it up if that was a concern.
Just a general overview comment. We know the groundwater levels have been going down over time, especially after 2016, and that's been a positive development, but I think eventually it's going to reach an equilibrium, and the equilibrium may be above a new standard, a new AGQS. So I'm not sure that we're looking at a terminal solution here, but as you point out, if there's a new AGQS, that's grounds to open the permit. So thank you very much, Kathy. If there are no other questions or comment, oh, Mindy.
I have a bunch of questions, but so I saw Don's and Nancy's hands up before mine. So do they have short questions? If they wanted to go first, that's fine. Don, you want to go first? It's fine. I'll wait my turn.
All right, I do have just a couple of quick ones. Kathy, you mentioned something about testing. You referred to EPA method 533, which I know is for water. But how many compounds are being measured in the air samples? Is it the same suite as the 533?
There's 50 compounds.
Oh,
I don't know off the top of my head comparison. I mean, they're generally the final product, the PFOA, the PFOS, the PFNA, the typical, but there's also some fluorotellumer alcohols and Gen X that's in there. So
okay. And I guess the only other question I have is the proposed 4 parts per trillion MCL by EPA. That isn't going to have an effect on the discharge limits because the amount that you're considering that's going into the ground is still less than the 4 parts per trillion. Is that true?
Is it 4 parts per trillion for PFOA? Is that
Yes, right.
Okay. Yeah, no, we compared it to the reporting level of 3.4 parts per trillion. So I don't know if the reporting level will eventually get better with lab technology, but that's about where it was at for the 533 method when it was developed.
All right, so right now, we're comparing the 12 and the 3.4 to the 12, but it sounds like we're going to be comparing 3.4 to 4 if that new MCL goes into effect. So we just wanted to see if that was the case, but all right, that's fine. That's all I had.
Okay, thank you. Nancy, did you have questions?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Kathy, for taking my questions. I just, I'm sort of feeding off of what Laureen said, and from the citizen point of view, with health always as the biggest concern for residents, and just historically the trust that we have with Saint-Gobain's meeting permit requirements and being forthcoming and that kind of stuff. Relying on Saint-Gobain to self-report is always a concern to us. And I see in some of the new permit, if things look good in certain areas for a certain period of time, then they would be allowed longer time frames within which not to have to test things. And the concern is, nighttime operations that may not be reported to be occurring, and that once that we've stayed under the radar for a while, and then we know we're not going to get have things tested for a while, that things could change. So I think there's a huge trust issue here I know that's not your issue, but it's a huge issue for the people that live here. And one of the questions that I had was around the reporting of the RTO monitoring in terms of the temp being below 1832. It's only up to 3 consecutive hours. So if it's whatever, anything beneath that, or it's 6 hours in a day, but it's not consecutive, it's broken up. That how does DES know that that happens other than the self-reporting that St. Gobain is supposed to make?
Sure. So just a clarification, the 2 tests, stack tests within this permit term and then going to 3 years, that's only for testing, stack testing frequency. All the other record keeping has to remain the same. And their record keeping, the data system that's set up for their RTO sends all that data to a recorder off, it's all computerized. All those records we've accessed, we've looked at, we've evaluated during the last inspection I was there. We looked at all that data. So we can ask for that information at any time. And that data is compiled into the annual report. So again, we can go back and say, gee, you had 6 hours on one day. What were your numbers and whatnot? Again, this is an annual standard, 3 hours below, a certain temperature, or even 6 hours during a day, but not 3 consecutive. Probably, if it was 1600 degrees and it lasted that long, we'd see that too. I mean, so we are keeping tabs on them. It's just the stack testing frequency, and a stack test is conducted with our staff present. So it's not like they can run the equipment in a way that brings the numbers down, or they can take the test a different way. We monitor all that. So it just wanted to explain that, as well as we can inspect it anytime. So, there's a lot of eyes on this. In terms of, I think your question was, how do we know that they're not doing something at night, or was there another part to that just?
Well, I mean, I know this was figured, you had said originally something was figured in 4, even though they say they're only operating whatever, so many hours a day.
Mm-hmm.
That's what may be reported. I don't know that community members think that those is necessarily accurate. So all of these numbers that you're taking into consideration would allow for 24-hour a day maximum production, even though that's not permitted, and even though that's not what is being DES is being informed would happen. I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying I just want to know that what this permit would allow for would take into consideration what would happen if, instead of the working hours that we're being told is happening, that's extended.
So for example, for the PFAS limits that are in the permit, they are based on the model predicting how much is actually going to land in any 1 square meter and looking at the worst case level, and back calculating how much those emissions could be every second or every hour or whatever.
Okay.
So then, assuming that they ran 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, you get this pound per year limit. So we are taking into consideration, if they ran as much as they possibly could, this is the most they could do. So if they run less hours, they're still going to be less than the pound per year based on this evaluation, based on records. So it's not like we're factoring in any kind of limitation. There is none, but I don't think they run 24 hours a day. I know they don't run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, all the towers simultaneously. That's just.
Yeah. Last question, Kathy, thank you. I know there was, what are, and I think of this from a legislative perspective as well, why I'm asking the question is, what are the consequences for violations of these permits? Is it just, I think we've seen in the past that timeframes haven't been met and violations have occurred. And I just think, since we're focused on what we need to do to make sure that we are protecting our environment and public health here, it has to be worth it to comply with these permit requirements. So if there is non-compliance with those, what is, and I know it probably depends upon what the non-compliance is, I'm betting, but what is DES able to, what are the actions DES would take?
So DES would follow the Compliance Assurance Response Policy, or CARP. I'm not an expert on the CARP itself in terms of thresholds and what the actions would be. That would be our Enforcement Bureau, and then our legal unit upstairs in the Department of Justice. So I guess I really couldn't answer definitively what would happen, but we would follow the CARP.
Okay, CARP. Thank you, Kathy.
Okay, now Mindy, thank you.
I see Representative Woods left. Unfortunately, I was going to comment on something he mentioned, which, there are 12,034 PFAS chemicals that EPA acknowledges are in existence. And that's why many have tried to ask for regulation by structural groups instead of one by one, the whack-a-mole we're playing right now. And it's important because I heard Kathy's comment about the stewardship agreement. They really don't have to phase them out, even though they all said they did. And if they did, they put something else in that readily transforms on the environment or in the wastewater or wherever to these other legacy compounds. We know it's happening all over New Hampshire right now with wastewater in particular. We just had a presentation by DES last week about this in another commission. So, the synergistic effects of the health of, associated with these chemicals is really important. That's a great point. The studies, as you know, to make those kinds of conclusions are very difficult to do. And I know there are some underway that are attempting to do at least some of that, but DES unfortunately rejected our request a few years ago to look at regulating these chemicals as a group in like a half-a-page letter from Commissioner Scott. So I would, certainly be happy to help legislators entertain something like that again in the near future, because this is what we've heard today. To me, is very disconcerting in a lot of ways. I mean, it's great. A lot of work has been done. Kathy, it's great, and it's a great presentation, but I share some of the other commission members' concerns about trust but verify. And is there any real-time monitoring for PFAS in the air around this plant? Because I'm not so sure that I would trust them without verifying that, Kathy. That's my first question.
Oh, well, there's certainly not continuous emission monitors for PFAS out of the stack. In terms of ambient sampling, at this time, there's no plan to do that. We did have some rainwater studies that were done where they sampled once a month for a year. The concentrations that were found in the water, in some cases, were less in Merrimack than they were in Concord in some samples, and pretty comparable, to what was seen in Merrimack and in Nashua at the same time. Sometimes it was non-detect. So ambient samples are only going to pick up what blows to an ambient sampler. That's why I tend to prefer stack tests, because it's coming from a source. We do have some background, I would assume, of PFAS as well from other sources. So there's no plan at this time that I'm aware of.
Okay, then I have some other questions. So I know that a couple of years ago when we met, there was a pretty exhaustive search done on ensuring that we understand all the components in the manufacturing process that could be contributing to PFAS emissions in that plant. Are you still, I've heard things like they make grill sheets and things like that. I'm not sure if that's considered to be a fabric or a film, and if those are all captured in the system. Do you happen to know? And what happens if they change and add other materials that they manufacture that could also be contributing to the PFAS emissions?
All of the PFAS sources are tied into the control device. I'm pretty confident about that. I've walked through the plant. If they made changes, at this time we have the statute, but we don't have the rule saying what they would have to notify us if they wanted to install a new piece of equipment. One would assume that with the scrutiny and the amount of involvement, they wouldn't add a piece of PFAS component without getting a permit condition, but there's no permit threshold for needing that. Right, well, okay, but there is, we do intend to go out with a rulemaking shortly. We've got a sort of a draft rule that we're putting together for PFAS, which ties to the actual statute that was, the RSA 125C10E that requires the BAC also allowed us to do rulemaking. So we're doing some draft rule right now and hoping to go out to stakeholder groups in the fall or in the winter time to get that rule situated, and that would most likely have some thresholds in terms of what you would have to report and get information or permits on. So I would welcome maybe some input at that point. But in terms of the facility, they're required under the backed rule that if you give a device that contributes, that you're required to have back. So I think by default, if you have a PFAS source, you would have to tie it into the thermal oxidizer. That's why some of those small devices that weren't permitted before are now tied in. So.
Okay, and then is there any way to ensure that, or have you tested the exhaust fans to ensure that they're working properly, or maybe they don't, maybe don't need to be upgraded, so that we ensure all the fugitive emissions are going up into the stack to be treated?
So every stack test that they've conducted, so 2021, 2022, and again this year, they have to do a method 204, I think it is. It's a capture efficiency test, and we do that during the stack test. And then they have settings on the equipment to make sure that they're kept in those positions during regular operations. And then inspectors can check to make sure of that. That's why the permit says you either do that testing or you put on pressure gauges. So they have that option to put on pressure gauges. So the intent is to minimize fugitive emissions and to ensure that the devices are operating that way. So they did all of the balancing of the fans and whatnot when they installed and designed the thermal oxidizer. They upgraded a lot of fans already at that time, especially the QX machine. It's in its own room, and then they upgraded all the fans in that room. So that work is being done. And they also have maintenance schedules and requirements for all of this that we also keep records of and track. So
just to be sure, so that you're confident that the emissions, most of the emissions inside the plant are actually going up through the treatment system. Okay. I noticed that in the bypass operations, generally that's triggered by an inlet temperature exceedance. I don't know if that's the case or not. And if so, isn't there a way to control that so that they have less of those inlet temperature exceedances?
I would say that the majority of the bypasses occurred during the first 6 months, where any type of new device that gets brought online has a shakedown period. I don't have the numbers right in front of me. I'd run them and apparently didn't save them for today's presentation, but it was like something like 50 hours in the first year and like 9 in the last year. And most of that was power outages, if I remember correctly. So I think they're working through sort of the production, operations issues and getting better. I wouldn't say it's a high temperature issue. 90% of the time, I'd say it's actually a power outage thing. The last couple have been because of the storms.
Okay. And then I had a question about the air mod sample, the air mod modeling. So is that air mod modeling you referred to in this slide and other slides, is that calibrated to the site conditions or to the site specifically, or is it just sort of a general model that you look at a cube of land and see what happens?
No, we use topographical information. I'm not a modeler expert, but we use the actual facility, the building parameters, the stack parameters, the flow temperature of the exhaust. We use the terrain around the area, it's all in digital format, weather conditions for the past 5 years out of Manchester. So it's very site specific. The model itself is designed to be generic. It refers more toward like what wet deposition, dry deposition, how that works. But in terms of the input of the parameters of the building, the stack and the terrain, that's all local.
So is it back calibrated to historical quantities of PFOA used?
No, the model that was used in this case was to say if you had 1 gram per second, 1 unit of PFOA or PFAS, 1 gram of it coming out every second for a year, what would that impact be? And the prediction from that model was that for every gram per second coming out of the main stack, you had about 0.2 grams that were going to land in that square meter. And the bypass stack had more like 0.9 grams that were going to land in that square meter. More of an impact because it's a downward facing and lower temperature exhaust point closer to the backside of the building, that kind of thing. But we put receptors every meter out a certain distance away from the stack. So we look at the surrounding area, the topography of the area. And then this was the worst case square meter area receptor.
So it wasn't based on historical quantities of use? Because I was a little, so I heard your comment about 2% in the raw materials of PFOA that was used, but there's a lot of evidence to say that they actually used a lot more pure PFOA in the dispersions to make them, and I think you probably know about that information I forwarded out to the agencies. So I was worried that any of that information wasn't being incorporated into this model. Okay. And does this model assume...
This model is strictly for this permitting exercise to predict the emission limits.
And does that use a worst case scenario of 175 hours a year of bypass operation?
Yes, to come up with the emission limits, it does, yes.
Okay. And one more question, I'm sorry to ask you so many, but is there a way to, you mentioned the lab detection limits at this RLs at this point. I know with, for instance, a groundwater sample, sorry, there's a fighter jet going over my house, if you can hear it. There are, you know, labs have really made a lot of improvements, and now a lot of labs can see down to 1 to 2 parts per trillion in the water for PFOA in particular, and some of these other compounds. And so I wondered if there was a way, instead of using like a blanket threshold of 3.4, if there could somehow be a sliding scale that accounts for improvements in analytical capabilities over time, because it is a 5-year permit. Or is there a trigger in that permit that says if labs can routinely report down to a lower limit, you know, it'll automatically change the calculations?
You know, that's a good question. Perhaps one that would be best submitted as part of the comments for this permit,
Okay.
because I don't think I could answer that today.
Okay. That's all I had. Thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, if there aren't any other questions, it's keep things moving along. Andy Fuller, give us a DES update.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Hopefully everyone can hear me all right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andy Fuller. I'm a hydrogeologist with the Hazardous Waste Remediation Bureau, and I'm the project manager for the Saint-Gobain Performance Plastics Site. Director Wimsatt was traveling today, so he wasn't able to be here. So I'm going to give a brief update of everything that's been happening over the last month and maybe a little bit further back. Hopefully I'm not duplicating too much information that you guys have already heard. So Saint-Gobain's contractor, Second Wind Water Systems, started their POET installation process for residents within the towns of Bedford and Merrimack back in November of last year. And at this time, nearly all homeowners in both those towns have been notified of their eligibility to set up the pre-installation inspection, which was the first step in that. In May, Saint-Gobain finalized the contract with Culligan Water to complete POET installations as well. And on June 1st, they sent out a batch of letters to 185 residents, excuse me, in the towns of Londonderry, Hudson, and Litchfield, notifying them of the filtration system contractor and requesting that the property owners set up their pre-installation inspection. So far, a total of 621 notifications have been sent out to the 658 eligible property owners. So they've made good progress, and nearly everyone's been notified and can start the process. First POET system was installed in December of last year, and as of May 5th, we have had 182 systems installed. Second Wind's currently installing systems at a rate of about 10 per week. Culligan Water is anticipating being able to install approximately 25 to 30 systems a week after an initial ramping up period. They're going to have a little bit stronger manpower during those installations. And the contractors are continuing to indicate they believe they will all be installed before the end of the year. As described in the approved work plan for the installation of the POET systems, Saint-Gobain is responsible for the confirmation testing of the system to ensure its effective operation. And due to the requirements of that work plan, approximately 95 of the POET systems are actually considered officially complete, because the installation is not considered complete until the property owner has been notified and provided the sampling results to confirm that it's operating as intended. As you might have been previously reported to you, initial installations identified the presence of PFOS in some of the confirmation samples from those POET systems. The longer flush times that Saint-Gobain, their contractor, has been implementing has reduced the frequency and concentration of those detections, but its presence hasn't been completely eliminated. My understanding is there are no longer any AGQS violations, but it's getting a lot better. The investigation is ongoing. Additional samples are now being collected in kitchen sinks in addition to the post-treatment sample port. The kitchen sink samples representing, system effluent while minimizing the potential for leaching from any of the system components. Lab turnaround times and review of those analytical results is kind of delaying the confirmation of the exact source of the PFOS. Their consultants conducting additional component blanks on individual plumbing components in an effort to kind of isolate that specific part of the system that's contributing it. As I believe Director Wimsatt notified you during last month's meeting, Saint-Gobain announced they're going to begin a POET system rebate program for eligible homeowners. They're under eligibility terms that are determined by Saint-Gobain. According to the announcement, the program is going to be providing a one-time rebate up to $5,000 to eligible homeowners who installed a system at their property to treat drinking water for PFAS prior to being offered a system as part of Saint-Gobain's installation program. Does not appear that homeowners who installed a treatment system are going to be eligible if they are offered a connection to public water. And that rebate program is still, as far as we know, on track to be open for applications on July 1st. As far as municipal water, Saint-Gobain is proceeding with the design work for water line installations in the towns of Litchfield, Bedford, and Merrimack. These are areas with existing water lines where homes require connections to the water mains in the street, and as well as areas where new water mains are going to be installed. The design package for water main extension service connections in the Hillcrest Road area of Litchfield has been completed. Bids have been received for this work, and contract documents are being drafted up by the water utility and being reviewed by Saint-Gobain. Construction for the water line extension to that area is anticipated to occur over the summer with substantial completion in the winter, but that's dependent on contractor and material availability, of course. Final design packages for connections to existing water mains were submitted to the utility providers for both Merrimack and Bedford. Comments from those utilities are being reviewed by Saint-Gobain, and they are indicating that construction for these areas is going to go out to bid likely during this summer. And Saint-Gobain's consultant is nearing completion for design on the waterline extension project in the Wildcat Falls and Brenda Lane area of Merrimack. They are continuing to work with the water utility and evaluating the feasibility of the water line to extension to the town of Londonderry. There was a conceptual design completed by the water utility that was wrapped up at the end of April, and it's currently being reviewed by Saint-Gobain. DES is going to be meeting with Saint-Gobain and the water utility later this month to discuss the findings of that conceptual design evaluation. Last month, actually in April, we received a letter from Saint-Gobain that proposed delaying the submittal of the groundwater management permit until they collected a second set of samples from all the drinking water wells at the site. We concurred that a collection of the confirmation sample would assist in delineating the groundwater management zone and help in developing the long-term monitoring plan that's going to be required under that permit. We issued an approval letter in May, and we have requested that the application for groundwater management permit be submitted in May of 2024. With respect to the water supply well sampling, up until recently, Saint-Gobain consultant WSP has been retesting the wells with PFOA results between 10 and 12, and then sampling additional wells that they identified within the consent decree area. They're going to be proceeding with the effort to collect that second set of samples within the consent decree area, and they've indicated that effort is going to take approximately 9 to 12 months to complete. At DS, we are still continuing to express a need for some additional sampling to be done within the consent decree area. There's still some areas where Saint-Gobain has declined to sample on the periphery of the outer boundary. As far as site investigation remedial action, the remedial action plan was submitted to DES in May, and we're currently reviewing that submittal and formulating a response. In summary, the RAP provided alternatives for both soil and groundwater. For soil, that included the use of institutional controls, low permeability capping was evaluated, excavation and disposal of soil was also evaluated. For groundwater, that included evaluation of institutional controls and monitor natural attenuation, a groundwater hydraulic control and treatment, as well as passive in situ groundwater treatment. Each of those alternatives in the reports evaluated with respect to its effectiveness, reliability, feasibility, ease of implementation, risk reduction, associated benefits, cost effectiveness, and cleanup time comparison. And those are all stipulations of ENBOR 600 in our rules. I will tell you that in general, DS, we felt that document fell short of our expectations in that a lot of detailed cost estimates weren't included for all of the more active remedial alternatives. And we are going to be meeting with Saint-Gobain to discuss the contents of that plan later this month. So And that's about all I have for specifics from the Waste Management Division. So I'd be happy to take any questions anyone has.
Yes, Rosemary.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Andy. Regarding Saint-Gobain's rebate program that's starting on the 1st, do you have an estimate about how many homeowners would be eligible for that? So these are people who installed POET systems, but later were not hooked up to municipal water, and they're within the consent decree, correct?
Are you referring to people that were proposed to be connected to municipal water, or just people that were, the program is designed to, as a rebate for people that might have already, say, Saint-Gobain proposed that they were going to be, or they didn't want to wait for Saint-Gobain's decision on what they were going to do for their alternate water. So it's people that probably were proactive and installed the system on their own beforehand. As far as the numbers, I don't have a good idea of exact numbers. I'm estimating just off the top of my head, might be on the order of 40 or 50, but that's mostly based off of me fielding calls from residents on the matter.
Okay, because I feel like anyone who installed a POET system on their own should be eligible for that rebate, whether they were later hooked up to municipal water or not. And especially, I mean, I know I'm just kind of airing a grievance, but I do intend to communicate with Saint-Gobain about having them refund the Merrimack School District. It's about, I think, $120,000 for the filtration system they installed after this contamination was discovered. But I'm very angry at Saint-Gobain for not recognizing everyone that went through an incredible personal expense to respond to the contamination. I don't think everyone should be eligible for that. That's just venting.
I understand what you're saying. I'd be happy. I'll be more than happy to bring that up during our next conversation with them.
Yeah, definitely. They will be hearing from me. Yeah.
Nancy?
Thanks, Chris. I just wanted to ask Andy, just for confirmation, in case anybody, members of the public are watching. So the rebate would be just for private well owners who put that on, not public well owners, excuse me, public water, citizens whose public water was contaminated and did the very same thing for the very same reason. Just sort of hard for me to understand why, if our public water is contaminated and people had the good sense of trying to protect their health of their families, whether they were on a private well or drinking public water, I would think that if the rationale was truly to protect public health, it shouldn't matter whether it was a private well or public water, that all citizens who took that upon themselves should be eligible. So is that something is that a possibility, or?
My understanding, it's going to just be for private water supply well owners now. It's going to be tailored very similar to the New Hampshire program that was rolled out for properties outside of the consent decree area. But that's something that I could also bring that up during our conversations with Saint-Gobain too.
That would be really appreciated, Andy, because I think there are some, anybody that paid attention in the beginning knew what we had to do early on, and prior to us getting warrant articles that I was paying to get our public wells cleaned up, people had to still do something. So that would be great. I'd appreciate that if you could do that. Thank you.
Don?
Thanks, Andy, for your discussion. Kind of just to dovetail off of what Ms. Murphy was just describing, being the chair of the Board of Commissioners at MBD, I can tell you that, MBD water was not compliant probably as far as most recent as like 6 months, basically. Our last treatment plant just went online in March. So I think that's a good point that Nancy raised about that. So it'd be good to talk to Saint-Gobain about that. I know a lot of people put treatment in their homes because it just took, years for us to get all of our wells treated at MBD. But I do have I know as far as the discussion that you presented on the remedial action plan, so it sounds like there were no proposals for any pump and treat of the groundwater. Was that the case?
No, they did have they evaluated a remedial alternative for hydraulic control and treatment. So that would actually include extraction from groundwater above or up gradient from the facility, as well as extraction within source areas or higher areas of higher concentration. Those were evaluated.
And that would include running it through some carbon filters to remove the PFAS or something like that?
Most likely something along those lines, yeah.
Any discussion about like in situ barriers, groundwater barriers and gateways to treat the water, to direct the water through the gateways or anything like that? Probably not.
They did evaluate some passive treatment. The way they tailored their the wrap was that was going to be treating groundwater that came onto the site. I guess that would be assuming to be, then groundwater would be clean and then flush and flow across the site.
Okay.
They had indicated in there that use of passive kind of in situ treatment that you mentioned there, that restoration of interior groundwater would be impractical using those types of methods. So.
Thanks for telling me, because I just been so busy I hadn't had a chance to review that myself yet. So, and just along those lines, what's the timeline on? Is there a certain deadline that your department needs to respond to this application or anything?
No, we don't have a deadline in our rules of when we need to respond. We have a meeting scheduled for later this month, but Saint-Gobain had asked for that, and that they're going to be kind of presenting the findings of the remedial action plan. So we will probably, in the interim, we're going to be working up our response, but we wouldn't finalize that until after that meeting, just in case something changes from the basis of those discussions. So I would anticipate us having a letter out to this effect, after that, sometime in July or August. So.
Okay, and just one last question. I assume there would be some kind of public hearing on this before any kind of approval was granted. Would that be the case?
I'm not sure of that process. I don't think that that's the case with every site, but I'm sure that there would be some sort of announcement and discussion to that effect. So, but I couldn't really say. Like a typical site management wouldn't involve the public necessarily. It would be the department, but This is obviously a different animal.
Quite atypical, I would say. I think the town of Merrimack and basically all southern New Hampshire would appreciate if there was some kind of a public hearing. I know, for instance, the air permit that Ms. Beam was presenting, there's a public hearing or a discussion on that on June 21st. So I would certainly advocate for that to happen if you can, bring that back to the department and let them know that was a request. I appreciate it.
Sure,
Thanks.
be happy to.
I don't know if everybody has that background noise. Or Mindy?
Might be Laureen. Hi, Andy. Thanks for that update. I'm glad to hear that Saint-Gobain is being compelled to go out and resample the wells within the consent decree in other areas. And I heard you say 9 to 12 months. So I'd asked this, I think, about a year ago of Mr. Wimsatt, if those letters that go out then to the people who have been sampled will have some verbiage in there, especially now that, the MCLGs are in place and that the EPA is looking at MCLs that are much lower than the state numbers, which would then presumably cause New Hampshire's numbers to go down. Is that going to be in the content of those letters going out to those people once they're with their analytical results after the sampling is completed? And the second part of the question is, do you happen to know how many compounds they're being compelled to test for?
I don't believe that language would be included in those letters. Those are letters that are sent. The result letters are sent out by Saint-Gobain's consultant WSP. They don't typically get into discussions along the lines of proposed MCLs and other things, because what they're comparing to obviously are AGQS. So that I don't believe that language would be included in those letters, and they don't come from the department, so we don't necessarily have comment on those. And what was the second part of your question?
I think the department could compel them to, though, couldn't they?
We could discuss that with them. We do bring it up to the potential for the changing of the MCL all the time. When we and how it would affect the project. Saint-Gobain is obviously they're thinking about those in the event that the MCL were to be lowered. But as a department, we're required currently to work within our rules, I guess I would say, and what's actually an enforceable standard. So.
And the other question was how many PFAS are they sampling for in those samples?
I believe it's the 9 that they're currently sampling for.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Andy? Yeah, I have one, Andy, on resampling. About this time last year on the environmental subcommittee, we looked with Jeff Martz at plotting the resampling data that had taken place. And that was just a very preliminary look at some limited data. And now that we have more data, just wonder if that, we could have an update on that at some point.
I could look into that further. I believe the numbers were pretty consistent. Still, it was about, my understanding was that it was about a third of those resamples might have increased, a third went down, and about a third stayed the same. But we could look into that just to make sure that those statistics are still the same.
Okay, going forward to our next subcommittee report, it would be good to have that data over the course of the summer. So we'll follow up offline. All right, thank you. Michelle, you are up next.
Sure, thank you. So the Department of Public Health Services has finalized the PFAS medical provider fact sheet, and I shared a copy of the fact sheet with the chair, along with these particular updates, which I'm happy to forward to Representative Murphy if you would like those for the notes, if you'd like. So I will do that as well. The fact sheet is aimed at helping to increase awareness and answer common questions that medical providers may have relative to PFAS. Partners at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, Dartmouth, the Pediatric Environmental Specialty Unit, the Northern New England Poison Center, and additional physician partners associated with Dartmouth provided input on fact sheets drafts during multiple stages of the process. What you'll see is the PFAS medical provider fact sheet is based on ATSDR clinical guidance. But with that said, I do want to make note that on the sort of at the beginning of the document on the front page of the fact sheet, we do reference, we call attention to the fact that ATSDR is currently reviewing and updating guidance based on the July 2022 national or the NASEM report, and we do provide a link to the NASEM report. We give them some background as to ATSDR's goal with respect to that study, and we also highlight that updates, any updates done to either clinical guidance or regulatory information related to PFAS will require us to go back and update this fact sheet. So know that it's sort of a living, breathing document that as the science evolves and as information comes out, we will go back and work with our stakeholder group and update this document. The initial distribution will occur through medical professionals and association channels, obviously legislative commissions, and through our internal and external advisory teams at related conferences and listservs. So we really are looking forward to getting this information out. We will have it on our website. Certainly if you have a particular option of distribution, happy to hear it, and please send that along to us. We're looking forward to getting this information out. The next update that I have is that the department worked closely with Representative Murphy and others, I think Representative Rung and Mooney as well, on HB 614, which is an act relating to making an appropriation to the department to fund a phase 3 feasibility study in Merrimack. The department continues to convene and plan next steps in response to community concerns in Merrimack and the surrounding communities. The bill was, as you know, I think I reported this last month, the bill was retained in the House Finance Committee and added to HB 2, House Bill 2. DHHS has been following it through the state budget process. And the good news is that the Senate the Senate voted to finalize the budget. The House concurred, and it's on to the governor's office for signature. That's my understanding, and I'm sure our fellow representative and legislative members can update on that. But the good news is that appropriation is still in the budget. So it's looking very good that the appropriation for that feasibility study will remain in there. So we have been working to, as I reported last month, the department will use those funds to establish a contract with an academic institution to help us with that feasibility study. So we're continuing to work on that, and we'll certainly keep this commission informed as we move forward. And the last update that I have is relative to the Environmental Public Health Tracking Section Administrator position, formerly held by Dr. Katie Bush. We're currently recruiting for this position, and I hope to have an update on filling the position for the next commission meeting. So stay tuned there.
Okay, thank you very much. Questions for Michelle? All right. Seeing none, good segue to Maureen Mooney, and congratulations to our legislative members, and thank you for all of your work on 614 and also 212 and 311, which I see from your update are on their way to the governor's desk. So those are very welcome accomplishments, and thank you all. So now, having stolen your thunder, perhaps turn it over to you, Maureen. Thank you as always for your updates.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, members of the commission. We can never talk about House Bill 2 enough, so by all means, I'm glad that was a great report. A lot of legislative updates since last time. As was just mentioned, House Bill 2 sailed through yesterday, which was unprecedented, and 3 of the bills we've been tracking this term are included in House Bill 2. As was mentioned, that's 614, the cancer study for Merrimack, still funded at the $500,000 that was originally requested. Also House Bill 212, which was the response fund sponsored by Representative Rung, and then House Bill 311, the Municipal Water Pollution Control Bill. All of those remain intact in House Bill 2, and the governor should be signing House Bill 2 into law next week, I think, with an effective date of July 1st, 2023. So all in all, very good in terms of this commission outcomes in House Bill 2. Updates on 2 other bills. One was Senate Bill 123. That was sponsored by Senator Waters, and it was signed by the governor last week. So you may recall that was in regard to adoption of ambient groundwater quality standards. And then House Bill 214, Representative Rung's bill, is still, as I understand it, on the governor's desk. We're waiting for a signature. It should be signed, I would think, relatively soon. So those are the reports there. All good news on those 5 bills that, again, we've been tracking. And I also want to mention that I want to thank everybody for looking at the membership chart that I put together and announced last month. I was very glad to get the feedback that I did. So I think I have a pretty accurate chart in terms of who's on the commission and how they were appointed. So with that, I'll conclude my agenda item, and I want to thank you all very much.
Thank you. Any questions for Maureen?
I should also add, if I didn't, that Representative Murphy was the prime on House Bill 614. That's the kidney study that, again, remains intact in House Bill 2.
All right, excellent. I am not aware of any subcommittee activity, but obviously over the course of the summer, we have to, as subcommittees, move the ball forward to prepare our November report for the legislature and governor, and to get that in some shape to hand off to the communications subcommittee for drafting. So July is generally a month when we have not met, and so there will be time for subcommittee activity. Mindy, I don't know if your hand is up. It is up. Or is it? Yes. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I couldn't find the unmute button. Sorry, I was gonna, if you're done with that, I wanted to make a couple of statements
Go ahead.
or requests, actually. Okay, so since we're not going to be meeting in July and the comment period for the air permit ends in June 23rd, I think it was wondering if the commission would be willing to issue a letter to as a commission to that in that permit process during the comment period. And if so, I'd be happy to help draft one up. And my second question was regarding the notification of well owners regarding the MCLs, and wondering if the commission would entertain a letter to DES requesting that they compel Saint-Gobain to put information about the EPA PFAS, MCLGs, and MCLs in the letters, notifying people of their water results. So 2 ideas for the commission to consider.
Nancy?
I just want to that. I'm wondering, maybe we could also, Mindy, in the same thing, add the request that those homeowners on public water who install filtration also be have the opportunity to have that reimbursed. So maybe do all 3 of those points if people thought that was a good idea.
I would be glad to work on it if somebody wants to put together first drafts. And we can.
I'd be happy to work on first drafts if you want.
Thank you. Rosemary. Yeah, I think you're muted, perhaps, maybe.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry about that. I want to thank Representative Mooney for tracking those bills. It's been very helpful. And I agree with Ms. Mesmer about the letter and the contents of that. Now, it's been my understanding that we have met in July. It's been August that we haven't met. But
that's my memory then.
Oh, okay. And my memory could be faulty too, but if at least if we do have a July meeting or an August meeting, one thing I would like the commission to have on the agenda and to discuss is potential legislation for this coming year, because the LSR period is from September 11th through September 15th. And so that's our only opportunity to submit legislation for consideration before this biennium term is up. And one specific legislation I'd like us to discuss is whether we would support having a LSR filed regarding medical monitoring. I believe that legislation was vetoed by the governor a few years ago, but I think particularly when we've seen the cancer study reports that I think we should be compelled to at least bring that legislation forward. So, and there might be other areas of interest to this commission that we may want to discuss a potential legislative remedy before we draft our report in October for the governor in November.
I myself have a conflict on that second Friday in August. So if I'm wrong about what the month we have off, second Friday in July is the 14th. I would be pleased to meet then. I have my own legislative idea to bring forward. So if that's the wish of the commission, let's do that, and that would take care of a conflict that I have.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, and we'll plan on doing it at 1 p.m. just because that seems to have worked out better. So that's 7/14 at 1 p.m. And on the agenda items will be proposed new legislation And then there are a couple of bills that have been retained in committee, and maybe we ought to look at whether there is life that can be breathed into those things.
Yeah, there are two bills specifically that have been retained in my committee resources. One is on private well testing. As the bill was submitted, it includes PFAS testing, but there's some issues with including that in the bill because of just the timing and expense. I'm kind of working through that with other committee members. We may find that it's more expedient to just get a bill passed that requires private well testing when new wells or replacement wells are being drilled, get that into statute. And then as we see what happens with the MCLs at the federal level, is to then amend that in the following year. So that's something that's up for discussion. The other bill was about notification on real estate transfers of the potential of PFAS contamination in water. I think that bill, it needs some work, but I think that will come out of committee with an ought to pass recommendation early next year.
Great. Okay. All right. And then other, one thing that we've talked about the last couple of meetings is the tax treatment of rebates for system treatment. I haven't heard anything further. Mike Strand, I see you're here, and no. I guess maybe that's something to start pushing on as we get to the end of the calendar year. People really need to know the answer to that. And then, I don't know if anybody has any insight on the multi-district South Carolina action and the recently remanded state court action. Those, it's a 3,000 plus docket item list down in that multi-district litigation. Obviously, there's some money coming, and I don't know what piece New Hampshire is going to get, if any, and anybody's got some insight on that. If not, I've posed the question to Alan Brooks, and maybe we'll get some information later on. And I guess other than that, unless there's any other questions or comments, we can, yes. Well, okay, many hands go up. Dr. Woods.
Thank you. A procedural question, certainly advocating for the letters to be proposed and worked on in the interim. But what's the mechanism for us to submit them as a material for the public hearing? What is that mechanism going to be, since we're not going to be meeting until July 14th? Is that going to meet the deadline for us to review those officially as part of our commission and vote on them? Or what is the anticipated procedural aspect to those letters?
I think probably most expedient would be for the commission to authorize the chair to issue those letters.
Okay.
And, but if the commission wants to review those in advance, I think we probably ought to at least informally circulate them. We can't deliberate on them, not without having a public session, but we are allowed to work on drafts and pass drafts around without a public meeting. So certainly I'd want to circulate whatever we're going to submit to the commission, but most likely a motion would be timely to delegate to the chair.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, I think Nancy got her hand up first. And all those in favor, please raise your hands.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, motion passes. And hopefully, Nancy, for you, that will be evident from the recording. let's see.
Sorry for the sidebar there. I just wanted something official such that it'll have the weight of the commission behind it.
No, excellent point, something I should have picked up on. So thank you for catching that. All right, Senator Ricciardi, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to address the medical monitoring because I had looked into that and there were some legal issues with that. And in the other commission that we're on, Mindy, Nancy, and I, we were planning on getting together and sorting that out and working on that. So I'd still like to do that.
Good, great. Thank you. Maureen, you had your hand up. Go ahead.
Just a minor housekeeping rule. The beginning of this year, we had changes in roles and a couple members in the commission. So as I recall, we didn't like revisit the issue of subcommittee membership and who's where and things like that. So I think that might be somehow important to either put a document out or just retouch if we're going to be looking at subcommittee meetings over the summer. You know, perhaps some of these subcommittees have met, but communications has not. We were kind of put on hold and we don't really have a clear agenda at this point.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I ask people to identify what their interests are and receive no response. So, you know, please take that offline. Let me know what you want to be on. I'm going to compel everybody who has been on environment to stay on environment, though, and welcome any new people.
Chris, speaking of subcommittees, and sorry I wasn't visible for part of the meeting, I just had some work conflicts, but as far as the point on, you know, issuing a letter, you know, to the EPA, or to Mindy's point, which I think is an awesome idea, to do everything we can in the court of public opinion and with direct communication to compel, you know, DHS to, you know, to notify people that there could be pending MCL changes for well owners. No assumption is needed, but help offered on any editing, writing, anything that can help save time. So I just wanted to add that for any involved.
Thank you, Mike. All right, any other questions or comments before we adjourn? Mindy, go ahead.
So I just wanted to be clear. So I suggested two different letters. One would go to the comment period for the air permit.
Yep.
And then the other one would go directly to DES. So I just wanted to be clear that that was what I was suggesting. So there's two different letters, two different audiences.
Yes.
Okay.
And just to be clear, the comment period ends June 28th.
Yes. Got it. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great rest of June, and we'll see you July 14th.
Great. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks.